I'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself first, and then we'll introduce the panelists after I read the land acknowledgement. So my name is Catherine Hayland. I'm a program manager with the One Health Institute. And this seminar is being recorded, and we'll have it later up on our YouTube channel, but you can also watch it. You can link to it through our seminar series webpage. So before I turn it over to Dr. Finnis, our moderator, I'd like to acknowledge with great respect that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that this gathering place and all the places we are joining from today is today home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we explore, share, discuss, and learn about our shared responsibility for human, animal, plant, and ecosystem health. So without further ado, Dr. Finnis.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this panel. My name is Elizabeth Finnis, and I'm the director of the One Health Institute here at Guelph, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel. Today, our speakers will talk a bit about their research, followed by a discussion, and we will have time for questions. So I encourage you to type any questions you might have into our Q&A panel. We have two panelists for today, so let me briefly introduce them. Dr. Diana Lewis is a member of the Sipekne'katik Mi'kmaq First Nation in Nova Scotia, and she is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Health Governance in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics in the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences. Her research interests are to foster a wider understanding of Indigenous worldviews and how those worldviews must inform environmental decisions, specifically as Indigenous peoples are impacted by resource or industrial development. She is a strong advocate for Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous-led decision-making, and is currently working with Indigenous communities across Canada to develop an Indigenous-led environmental health risk assessment approach. Dr. Michelle Wilson is a dedicated community-engaged artist who has developed place-based programs that combine creative arts with health and wellness concepts, and she is an assistant professor in the School of Fine Art and Music in the College of Arts. She works with critical disability studies and runs Prescription for Nature programs. Winner of multiple grants and awards, she has worked with many community partners, including Art City and Studio Central in Winnipeg and the Indwell Residences in London, Ontario. Her projects emphasize the importance of ecological stewardship and mental health, and her work was recently on exhibit at the Art Gallery of Guelph. So welcome to both of you. I should also say that we did have a third panelist scheduled for today, Dr. Heather Murphy, but I'm sorry to say that she is unable to join us after all. So with those introductions, let me turn things over first to Dr. Lewis and then to Dr. Wilson to talk a little bit about their research prior to our panel discussion.
Kwe nina daluisi Dr. Diana Lewis, Telewi Sipekne'katik, Ilnukadig na Mi'kmaq. And so in my own Mi'kmaq language, I'm introducing myself from Sipekne'katik First Nation in the traditional territory of Mi'kmaq, which is the Atlantic provinces. So seeing the topic of the presentation today, I wanted to come to this from a research perspective and how I do my research and how research like most Indigenous peoples are doing can be partnered with One Health. And so I found this article that just has been published in January of 2026. And I think that it's important for people in One Health to read this article because it was a really interesting perspective that's offered from Indigenous scholars. And the abstract reads, Understanding the intersections between Indigenous peoples and the One Health approach demands a fundamental reorientation of how translational work is conceptualized, enacted, and evaluated. Partnership between systems may be possible with a clear recognition by the One Health community of Indigenous rights and knowledge systems. The One Health self-alignment of Indigenous knowledges or ways of being is often appropriated without free, prior, or informed consent, consultation, or ethical co-design. This results in superficial or extractive engagement that does not uphold the sovereignty or integrity of Indigenous knowledge systems and paradigms. As scholars and researchers, Indigenous knowledges must be prioritized and partnered with. It is imperative that the One Health field move beyond mere inclusion towards structural transformation, decolonization, and long-term investment in Indigenous-led and governed models of health and well-being, land management, and science. And so then I thought about another article that I've just recently co-authored about research, and from doing community-based participatory research to doing Indigenous-led community-based participatory research. And I want to use my research to explain to you how this is all done. So in my Mi'kmaq worldview, I have what's called a relational worldview. So everything is related. We have responsibilities and obligations to animate and inanimate. And in comparison to the One Health approach, which is trying to look at animal health, human health, environmental health, in Indigenous worldviews, this is all interrelated. And so it's something that's been practiced for millennia. And it's hard for people, I think, to conceptualize what that looks like from an Indigenous perspective. So I'll use an example that I have of a research project that I started in 2010. I'm still working with the community. So this is Pictou Landing First Nation, and I was asked to work with the women in the community, the Native Women's Group, to look at impacts of pulp and paper mill effluent treatment facility on the health of the community. And an environmental health monitoring committee had been mandated by the federal government to oversee the health of the community and the impacts from the emissions from the mill and so on, and had conducted by 2010 about 70 studies that were concluding the health of the community had not been impacted. And the women knew intuitively something was wrong, but they didn't have any data to back up what they thought was going on in the community. And so to get to how Indigenous people are impacted, I go to a story that was shared by elders in the community, that within days of the effluent flowing into a body of water that bordered their community, and that was really culturally significant to the community, there was a mass kill-off of the fish. And this is 50 years later when they're recalling what had happened, and they're traumatized. And you can tell that the elders had carried this harm with them for a long, long time. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out from a Mi'kmaq perspective what that experience was. And so from a Mi'kmaq perspective and using our language, I can tell you that the way we are oriented in the world, the way we think about nature and the landscape, explains why the elders were still so traumatized. And so in Mi'kmaq, Gisul Melkigoden translates to the place of creation or nature. So it orients to how we think about the world, that nature is where we were created. We have another word, Wejiskaliyadink, which translates to where we sprouted from. We believe we are rooted in the landscape. So when Indigenous people talk about place-based frameworks, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about where they believe they're rooted. Tilnawaltik is how we will be Mi'kmaq, how we learn to be Mi'kmaq. And Nadugalamp is how we learn our values and norms, our responsibilities, our obligations, our being able to get out on the land and on the water and be with elders who can pass down these values and norms. And the body of water that was being polluted is what's in the center. And in Mi'kmaq, it's called Aseg, which translates to the other room. And once that body of water started being polluted, these connections were all disrupted. So in a relational worldview, that's very, very disruptive. From an Etiwabanuk perspective, and for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Etiwabanuk, it's a Mi'kmaq concept about looking at the strengths of Indigenous worldviews and Western science to understand the complexities of how Indigenous people are impacted when something happens to the air, land, and water around them. And so from the perspective of this story, this is from a Mi'kmaq perspective that I can explain this. The table here is from a Western perspective. It's conducting an environmental health survey where we ask people, if you're afraid of the air, land, and water around you, or how would you respond to, are you fearful of the air, land, and water around you? And those who said yes have a much lower reporting of good to excellent health and a higher reporting of mental health impacts. And so that's a way to look at it just very briefly. So I want to keep within my time. And so from my perspective, from all my relations, that's just a really quick overview of how I believe we are oriented in the world. So Walaliak, and I'll hand it back over to Beth.
Very interesting, and thank you for presenting that. And I will hand it over to Dr. Wilson now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michelle Wilson. My pronouns are she, her, and thank you to Dr. Finnis and the One Health Institute for the opportunity to be here today and to share my research and artistic practice and to share space with Dr. Lewis. It's such an honor. And I always like to start by situating myself both in the relation to the work that I do and the lands on which that work takes place. I identify as a queer neurodivergent mother. You might notice me crochet. It helps me stay present in the moment. An artist and a researcher. And throughout my life, and at times still now, I've been made to feel that these identities are incompatible or in tension with each other. And I think my work really demonstrates otherwise and insists otherwise. For me, these identities are deeply entangled, shaping not only how I think, but how I listen, care, and create. As a settler, my practice critically examines how I and my ancestors have both benefited from and contributed to settler colonial systems, while also attending to the ways those same systems have inflicted harm, particularly through class and gendered violence within the colonial project. One of the histories that ground this work is my own family's. My paternal grandfather was taken from his impoverished family in England at the age of 10 and sent alongside his 9-year-old brother to work as an indentured laborer on the stolen lands of the Kanahaka. They never saw their family again, and I return to this story often, not to claim equivalence of harm, but to sit with uncomfortable inheritances of settler colonialism and to ask what responsibilities it places on me now, and to think as a parent about what kind of futures my work might help to make possible. I think of myself planting seeds for a different legacy for those who come after me. So as you could tell from that introduction, the work that I'll be discussing today engages with histories and ongoing realities of settler colonial violence. These stories carry weight, and it's okay to be affected by them. I'm often affected by them while speaking, and it's something I no longer feel the need to apologize for. And where there is real sorrow in this work, I think that there are also profound acts of care, resistance, and repair. And it's to those possibilities that my practice continually returns. So today I want to introduce 3 research creation collaborations that I've been fortunate enough to be part of over the past several years. The Coves Collective, the Unsettling Conservation Collective, and the installation project, Those in Glass Houses. Each one emerges from distinct contexts and collaborations, but I think together they reflect an approach to creative research that really is grounded in a One Health framework, recognizing that human health, ecological health, and the well-being of other living beings are deeply interconnected. And it asks us to move beyond treating environmental problems, social inequities, or health outcomes in isolation, and instead understand them as part of a shared system. So in my practice, I approached these relationships through what I describe as a hope punk ethos, an ethic of radical care rooted in responsibility, repair, and collective imagination. Hope punk resists the logic that ecological collapse or social fragmentation are inevitable. Instead, it insists on staying present with complexity and working through collaboration, care, and creativity to cultivate conditions for healthier futures. Oh, I thought I turned the sound off on that. Let me just
Before human memory, a
do that so I
retreating
can
place.
talk over the video. There we go. So the Coves Collective, in 2022, I was part of a SSHRC-funded project called Gardenship and State, which set aside some of their resources to support grassroots initiatives. And I used that opportunity to bring together Indigenous and settler artists, community members, and activists to form what became the Coves Collective. The Coves, for those who don't know, is an environmentally significant area in London, Ontario. It's recognizable by a series of ponds that trace a kind of horseshoe alongside the Deshka and Seabee, also known as the Thames River. And it's important to note that long before settler occupation, this land was an important planting and gathering site for Indigenous peoples. But later, industrial activity and actually military activity contaminated the soil with heavy metals and debris. So this layered history of abundance, extraction, neglect, and repair became the ground from which the collective emerged. Within a One Health framework, places like the Coves illustrate how environmental conditions, social well-being, and cultural relationships to land are inseparable. Over the past 3 years, I've witnessed how working on the land brings together participants to engage in physical activity, creative practice, and ecological stewardship. These experiences foster social connection, reduce stress, support mental well-being, and while also deepening awareness of the ecological systems that shape health outcomes. And so in this sense, the work of the collective operates at the intersection of community health and environmental health. During workshops, we partnered with organizations such as Afloza Family Healing Services to host land-based art and education programs with youth and families. You can see in these pictures, Métis artist Sherry Osden-No led participants in making sculptural seed bombs, while Anishinaabe Kwe Candace Dube introduced plant medicines and facilitated medicine pouch making. My role in these gatherings often involves the practical labor, organizing logistics, preparing food, ensuring participants have what they need to safely spend time on the land. This kind of behind-the-scenes care work is essential to creating the conditions where meaningful relationships and learning could take place. To deepen our understanding of the land, we partnered with biologists Dr. Sheila McPhee and Dr. Brandon Samuels at Western, and we conducted some guerrilla soil testing across the site. The results revealed elevated levels of lead and chromium in several locations. One of the most contaminated areas was near a patch of goldenrod. And we know that goldenrod is a phytoremediator. It draws heavy metals from the soil. And what might appear to be a simple field of flowers becomes, through this knowledge, a visible process of ecological healing, and one that we work with through the collective. So we have done some projects like our textile map, tracing careful paths to translate these environmental relationships into artistic form. By stitching our walking routes using thread dyed with plants gathered from the site, the artwork becomes a record of movement, memory, and ecological processes. Through this work, art becomes a way of helping participants listen more carefully to the land and understand their relationships to the ecological systems that sustain life. Oh my goodness, I'm already at 7 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna skip to the Unsettling Conservation Collective. It was started through postdoctoral research with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership here at the University of Guelph. We just had an exhibition at the Art Gallery of Guelph that wrapped up in January. Sorry, I'm gonna have to go quickly through this. So as part of this work, I traveled to Wood Buffalo National Park and Fort Chipewyan in Northern Alberta. We did workshops at the Fort Chipewyan Museum, where we invited participants to share stories about meaningful connections to the land. What emerged were reflections not only on harvesting food and medicines, but also on the changes in ecosystem health associated with hydroelectric dams and the expansion of tar sands operations. Participants described changes in water quality, wildlife populations, and community health. And then that work led also to the development of an interactive sculpture titled "And What Love Is That?" that was created with collaborators, including Chloe and Robert Granjam, who we really worked together to develop this work. And here we are at Moose Island with 3 generations of the Granjam family and my own family. So this sculpture brings together Indigenous and settler natives through woven textile strands and engraved bricks that reference historical documents such as Treaty 8 and the National Parks Act. It's up on my website. Right now we are building out an online interactive version of this, which will actually function as a sort of archive, as a way to convey this information in a meaningful way, to respect both ways of knowing and not to flatten the complexity of those things. And to propose a different way of understanding archives. And yeah, the last project I wanted to talk about was Those in Glass Houses. It's opening at Forest City Gallery this spring. It examines how colonial systems of extraction shaped both human migration and ecological transformation. So as I mentioned before, I am a descendant of the Home Child program, so that really is what drove this work. So in the installation, I'm constructing a greenhouse from fused recycled plastics that resemble a translucent quilt. The structure references both the colonial greenhouse and the stained glass architecture of the church. And inside the greenhouse, 2 rows of plants are going to be growing in parallel. One contains naturalized medicinal plants brought over by settlers, so plantain, motherwort, and dead nettle, and the other contains native species such as milkweed, dense blazing star, and coneflower species that support pollinators. Yeah, so it's really interesting. Those plants are going to be conductive, so when you move through the space and touch the plants, they will play fragments of an audio poem. So you hear the poem just in parts. And then when you arrive at the kind of apex of the structure, you hear the poem in its entirety, but recited by my child and activated by pressing those 2 figures actually in the embroidery, which they drew and contributed to the artwork. I was hoping to share it, but I'm running along. So you will have to go to my website, I guess. Yeah. So although these projects emerge from different contexts, together they ask a shared question: how might creative practices help us imagine healthier relationships between people, ecosystems, and the more than humans world? Through land-based gatherings, collaborative storytelling, and interactive installations, this work explores how art contributes to the kinds of relational awareness that One Health calls for. Ultimately, these projects suggest that care for land, for community, and for future generations is not only an ethical commitment, but a necessary foundation for ecological and human health alike. Sorry, that was so fast. And here are a few of my Instagram accounts that will allow you to see more about that work and follow along. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your wonderful work, and for introducing your approaches with us, or to us today. So I have a few questions for discussion, and I can see that there are some questions that are starting to come through the Q&A. So we should have time to explore both sets of questions. And so I guess what I will start with is uh, sort of both hinted at this a little bit, but how did you come to a One Health framework? Or maybe if you would prefer framing it slightly differently, how did a One Health framework, or One Health, the notion of One Health, come to you? And I'm not sure which of you would like to start with responding to that. So I will leave that to you.
I could go first.
Great.
Mine is pretty straightforward. The Canada Research Chair that I currently hold is a One Health Research Chair. And so it's trying to find opportunity to bring that Indigenous perspective into the One Health program.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe I'll ask you a follow-up question since you raised that, and then I'll turn back to you, Dr. Wilson. How would you say that Indigenous methodologies inform your approach to environmental health risk, and how does that challenge or complement the sort of mainstream approaches that we tend to see within One Health?
I think that's how I tried to structure my slides, so that you could see when I'm guided by Etawabanunk, which is a Mi'kmaq concept for working within two knowledge systems, but using the strengths of both to convey important understandings of how Indigenous people can work alongside people who are using Western knowledge systems. The Piktukawak Environmental Health Framework that I presented, it can only be explained using Mi'kmaq concepts. Those concepts cannot translate to Western science framework. Things like how we believe we're related to everything has no Western equivalent, or how we believe we sprouted from the landscape, that translates to those place-based epistemologies. That doesn't translate to a Western framework. And so I'm very comfortable working in both systems of knowledge, but recognizing that they're distinct from each other as well.
Yeah, thank you. And just sometimes that the way that you move between them, does it sometimes sort of depend a bit on audiences that you're sharing research with?
Yeah, it depends. It depends, but I think most of the audiences that I'm in front of are interested to know how to work with Indigenous people, and my message is pretty well the same, that I have to respect Indigenous sovereignty and autonomy over knowledge systems. And so I'm very comfortable being in that space, but I also try to be comfortable in working with academics from other training perspectives. And so my presentations, I would say, are generally the same message of how to work between those. But what I've come to believe in more and more since I started doing this work is reflected in the second article that I shared, that it must be Indigenous led. It can't be shared and then have somebody else represented. It has to be represented by Indigenous people.
Yeah, wonderful. There's a question in the chat that sort of also follows up on this, but maybe I will, maybe I'll turn to that a little bit later, because I think it aligns nicely with some of what you've said. Thank you very much. So Michelle, or Dr. Wilson, I'll go back to you about this sort of how did One Health come to you, or how did you come to One Health as a framework?
I think during my PhD work, I was introduced to feminist new materialist scholars like Nancy Tuana and Jane Bennett. And I think that there is resonance with Indigenous ontologies and worldviews, the understanding of the agency and the connection with all beings, the way that our stories and our culture both are in a process constantly of forming the world and being formed by the world. So they are not the same, but perhaps complementary. And in reading those scholars and the interest of my work took me towards the practice of conservation and our relationships with the more than human world, mostly figured through a charismatic species like bison, but using them as the way in to tell these stories and to illustrate how what seems natural, the process of conservation and land protection, is actually an operation of colonialism, and only one way that kind of work could have been practiced, and certainly perhaps not the best. And so reading scholars like Eve Tuck and Leanne Simpson and Kim Tallbear and Zoe Todd led me to deeper understanding of how land with a capital L as this like expansive understanding is this dominant determinant of health, both of course for Indigenous people, but I mean also for settlers, if we want to understand how to thrive in this world and how to continue to live well in it, then we have to understand the relationality of being just one part, not master or at the top of this kind of web. So that I think is the perspective and that I bring to my work as an artist and as a community practice artist. And then I arrived at U of G and I found out about the One Health Institute, and I saw how that understanding aligned with the work that the Institute was doing.
Wonderful, thank you. So you talked about this a little bit in your presentation, but I wondered if maybe you wanted to expand a little bit about it. Expand a little bit on how artistic practices can help us to understand health and well-being differently, especially in contexts where sort of metrics might dominate decision-making or policy-making or sort of practices in terms of things like environmental remediation and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that artistic works and the artwork, What Love Is That Chloe and Robert Grandjam and myself developed together, have the ability to talk about perspectives that perhaps are often seen as being in conflict, or that when they're talked about together, there's a need, maybe an impulse to reconcile them with one another instead of to look at them in their full complexity and not need to arrive at a solution or a resolution, but to keep the question open. And I think, yeah, that is something that art brings to these kind of collaborations that's so strong, is that when we have completed an artwork, because it is so subjective, because it is metaphorical, because it puts interpretation onto the viewer, you don't need to arrive at something that's fully resolved. It just inspires more questioning, and that it can hold, I think, a lot of complexity that perhaps is elided or erased by facts and figures.
Yeah, I like the way that you put it, keeping the question open. It's a really nice way of thinking about things. Thank you. All right, so I have another question, and it's for people who are thinking about how or that they would like to incorporate artistic or Indigenous approaches, or maybe both, in a sort of broader One Health research agendas. And I wondered if you had advice to share about this, or if you wanted to address challenges you've had in integrating a sort of One Health language or I guess discourse within your core research approaches that people can perhaps learn from.
I actually am hosting a policy institute in a few months at the University of Guelph. And one of the challenges that we face over and over is getting someone to understand why Indigenous knowledge systems have to stand on their own, and what we're trying to convey when we're presenting frameworks from an Indigenous perspective. And because it's a challenge, we're going to use art to help convey that at the Policy Institute. And so I think it's called visual note-taking, when you have a graphic artist off to the side of the room and then presenting what your message is. And so I feel that that's going to be really powerful in the Policy Institute. We can say it in words, we can use diagrams, but the art has a much more profound way of conveying a message.
Interesting. Is that Policy Institute going to be something that people can register for?
No, actually, it's by invitation only. It's presenting the work that we've done in our 5-year research project to policy makers and decision makers. So we have to keep it by invite only. Yeah.
It sounds amazing. And what made you decide to try visual note taking at this event?
Because I've been trying to convey why health impact assessment and risk assessment doesn't work for Indigenous people using the current methodologies.
Right.
And it falls on deaf ears over and over and over and over. And we just are, trying to find ways that we can convey a message, and art works.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It sounds like it's going to be fantastic. I hope that it's everything that you hope it's going to be. Dr. Wilson, would you like to talk about what you might advise people to do, or challenges that you've had in incorporating artistic approaches?
Yeah, I think the visual note taker is amazing, and it's one avenue, but when it comes to doing the research itself, I think it's so important to bring the artists in early, because yes, artists can illustrate these concepts and convey them in ways that speak to the heart and to the mind. There's also something there's knowledge that is generated through the making. And so making alongside the other forms of research can be so generative, and the conversations around it can be so freeing. And then I think something where maybe there is tension when we do this work is that all art proposals are works of speculative fiction. And so you have to be comfortable with a certain amount of uncertainty, but that this really experimental nature of art is where the magic happens. And then, yeah, I don't know. I think we could have a conversation about ethics procedures and how they are not designed to facilitate, but also to hold accountable creative practices. Like, there are things that make sense for other folks in the humanities doing research that don't necessarily make sense for our practices. Like if we are making community-led art or co-creation, our participants are artists in themselves, and their knowledge needs to be valued that way. And so to erase their names and their identities from that work is not ethical. And so my experience with trying to talk with ethics boards about this kind of work is that either it's artistic practice and so not under their purview, or it just can't be done within the frameworks that are established. And yeah, we should neither be exempt from ethics review, but nor should our work be shut down. And I think there's an argument here for community-led relational understandings of ethics that Dr. Lewis, perhaps you would also like to see that.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And yeah, the ethics space can be tricky, right? And you're right, neither accountability, not like being exempt, but also not understanding the nuances of things is a really tricky space to navigate sometimes. Yeah. We are starting to sort of get close to our the wrapping up of our time, and so I thought I would maybe turn to a couple of the questions that have been posted. So one from Bill Morrison, I think it's for Dr. Lewis, and it sort of gets at something that you've already talked about, but so he says the research is exciting, but the non-research policy development that governments make difficult to educate the general public of Indigenous ways. How can we better introduce Indigenous ways to the public? And to some degree, I wonder if your discussion of art is part of the response here, but I maybe there are other things as well.
Yeah, that's a challenge for sure. And so we are working with government on health impact assessment guidelines for Indigenous-led health impact assessment, and conveying the importance of allowing Indigenous people to lead their own processes is a real challenge for policymakers to see why that's necessary. And it's possible that in the discussion between policymakers and Indigenous communities and Indigenous researchers, the artist is going to capture where some of those challenges might lay. I just had a student do a presentation, just finished their master's degree, where we analyzed when Indigenous people participate in impact assessment processes and they're conveying their value systems, which would be equivalent in a Western context to economic values. So what's important from a traditional economy to economic values of development. And the student was able to determine that despite Indigenous people sharing their values 900 and some times, 162 economic values trump those.
Wow.
Because of that disconnect. And so people are just not hearing each other. And so trying to break through that in the policy context is really a challenge that we're trying to address.
Yeah, those are striking. That is a striking result that you just described there. Yeah. There's another question for you, Dr. Wilson, that asks from Daphne. What made you choose the term hope punk, or has this research term been established, coined before? And Daphne adds, I say this is an alt-identifying person, both in dress and some ideologies. The term is new to me.
It's actually a term that was coined by a fantasy writer named Alexandra Rowland. So it usually is used to describe, fantasy works of fantasy. I would say that Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower is kind of a great example of how fiction can be in the hope punk genre. Like it's neither, you know, Pollyanna or escapism, but it also, I hear so many people say like, people are the problem with the world, humanity is a blight, why try? And abdicating responsibility. And I think hope punk sees, and I'm following the like writing of Adrienne Marie Brown as well, Emergent Strategy, that these small DIY actions that have very deep and personal impacts have ripple effects, generative effects, and that they are things that we don't need permission to do. So there, I guess that's where the punk part comes in. But when we find our web and our community, that those effects can be more than a sum of their parts, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're running out. Yes, so I've got another comment from, or a question from Bill Morrison. Is it possible to obtain the email addresses of your panel members? Yes, we can put that in the chat. And both Dr. Wilson and Dr. Lewis can be found, more information on them can be found via the University of Guelph websites as well. And I think we're coming up close to time. So maybe what I will say at this point is thank you so much for Dr. Lewis and Dr. Wilson for joining us today and sharing your work and insights. This has been an incredible conversation, and I really appreciate that you have shared your time with us. I also want to thank all of you for coming to this discussion, and I want to thank Catherine Hayland and Pete Kelly for all the work they did to organize and promote the session today. If you would like to know more about the work of the One Health Institute or support our work, Catherine is going to put a couple of links in the chat. I see there is a question, will there be a copy of this presentation and recording? And yes, a recording will be available later this week, and you can access that via our website, which Catherine is going to put in the chat in a moment. So thank you again to everybody, and I hope you all have a really lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.